welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Debunking the Missionaries with Rabbi Moshe Shulman. Rabbi, welcome back. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us again.
Okay.
How are you today, sir?
Okay, we are ready to start on a new show.
Very nice, very
Series.
nice. Looking forward to this, by the way. I know a lot of people are. We've talked about it in the past, and so you kind of like set the fire underneath us. Let's go for it.
Okay, the name of the series, of course, is The New Testament Real History. Now, just to clarify exactly what we're going to be doing, we are going to be examining the New Testament as far as whether it provides trustworthy history. And we'll describe what that is. And so we will discuss a lot of different events. A lot of it will revolve around the birth and the death of Jesus, which we have things that we could peg against, whereas in the middle of Jesus' lifetime, it's a little bit harder to discern things. And second, part of it is going to be discussing the resurrection, whether the New Testament gives a reliable historical justification for believing it. And then we're going to discuss the resurrection from another point of view, which is the modern apologetic that's very common in debates and apologetics by Christians, William Lane Craig, Michael Lucona, just Habermas, and others, which is called the minimal facts theory, which claims that if we look at those minimal facts which are accepted by all, then the most likely conclusion is that there was a resurrection. That's a semi-historical approach. They approach it as if not taking the New Testament history, but using to call it what scholars pull from it. So we'll do that. It's going to take us a number of weeks to do it, and we will probably allow for questions in the middle. I'll try and watch what's going on here. If there's a good question, I might actually answer it in the middle. So, okay, let's deal with the New Testament. In this sense, we're dealing basically with the Gospels. There's no real historical data that can be gotten from the letters from Paul or from the book of Revelation. A little bit maybe from the book of Acts, but the book of Acts does not interact with historical events in such a way that we could say, oh, is this what's with this or not? Most of the stuff would be arguing about errors that exist in there or certain types of contradictions which don't give or take or help or hinder in as far as what we're trying to do. Now, what do we mean by something being historical? Well, the Gospels claim to be an account of Jesus' life from his birth. At least Matthew and Luke deal with Jesus' birth. Mark and John do not. Interesting enough, the first Gospel and the last Gospel do not mention anything about Jesus' birth for different reasons. Okay, so when we're dealing with a book that's dealing history of a person, there's usually certain information that we really expect to have to be able to clarify distinctly. So, for example, things as far as birth and death, for example. Okay, so many times it's claimed that the life of Jesus is the most documented life. We know the most about that of anybody at that time. But the fact of the matter is really much different. Let's just go through some information of people who lived in the time of Jesus, or around that time, events that we know with much more accuracy than we know about Jesus. Number one, let's take this Octavian, also known as Augustus Caesar. He was a nephew of Julius Caesar. We know exactly when he was born and when he died. He was born September 23rd in the year 63 BCE, and he died August 19th, 14 CE in the Common Era. Okay, let's take Tiberius Caesar. His name was Tiberius Caesar Augustus. He was born November 16th, 42 BCE, and died March 16th, 37 CE. Okay, let's take one more. There was also the next Caesar that there was. His name was Germanicus, also known as Caligula. His name was Tiberius Claudius Germanicus. He was born August 1st, 10 BCE, and died January 24th, 41 CE. So we see people of certain renown in that time, of which we have quite a bit of information as far as exactly when they were born and exactly when they died. This is what is expected in history. There are history books about these people. Suetonius wrote, Tacitus wrote also. There's people who write histories, so we know things born, died, pretty much things that happened within their lifetime. Now, sometimes we're only able to discern, we only know about the death of a person when somebody died. So, for example, Alexander the Great died June 11th, 323 BCE. We know when he died. We have an idea when he could have been born, but we don't know when he died. Julius Caesar died the Ides of March, so everybody knows, March 15th, 44 BCE. So we know when that is. Now, sometimes there's important events. The resurrection is supposed to be one of the most important events in world history. So we should have some comparison to another event. That's the Battle of Actium. Actium was a battle in which Augustus, Caesar, Octavian, who was called at the time, defeated his enemies, Mark Antony, and their group of people, and became indisputed Caesar of the Roman Empire. That happened September 2nd, 31 BCE. We know next. In fact, that date is used in order to date other things, how long it was from that battle. And of course, sometimes we only know the year of somebody's death. We don't know exactly when it was, but we know when he was died that year. So, for example, Herod died in 4 BCE, and Agrippa the First died in 44 CE. We know this because of events that happened around it, whatever. But we know about that. Sometimes we don't know more, sometimes less. Depends on what the history books give us. But when we talk about historical record, what we're interested in most is, when we're talking about a person, do you know when he was born, when he died? That would put it on a certain level of history that we have. Now, the problem is that we don't have that for the New Testament. We're going to investigate a few things here, and we'll see that we don't really know exactly when Jesus was born, and we don't really know exactly when he died. All of the things that we hear from Christians and stuff like that, that's really speculation. So the question is the New Testament real history? Now, the historical Jesus has been a very big thing for a number of years. With regards to that, I have mentioned this book before, and we'll be approaching much later when we talk about the minimal facts theory. He discusses it in his book. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus from Michaelson, a very well-known person. Now, what he says, and he discusses the New Testament. And here's what he says with regards to the New Testament. On our question, is the New Testament real history? Is it historically reliable? No, he's talking about things being written down. As we remember when we discussed it, all of these things that were written down about the New Testament were written 30, 40, 50 years later. So the memories are selected and augmented by interpretive details. It's much worse than that, actually. I've been reading recently some studies that show that people forget huge amounts of things in stories. In time, they become uncertain, failed, faded, or distorted. Authorial intent often eludes us, and motives behind the reports are often difficult to determine. This is a challenge when we consider the 4 earliest existent biographies of Jesus, known as the canonical Gospels. There is somewhat of consensus amongst contemporary scholars that the Gospels belong to the genre of Greco-Roman biography, bios. Now, this is very important to understand what he's saying. He's trying to say that, well, it's a type of history. But what he's talking about when he says type of history is not what you and I would consider a history. So, for example, if we read a history of the World War II, we are expecting to hear dates and events pretty close to exactly how they occurred, at the time they occurred. D-Day, for example, was June 6th, 1944. Okay? And events of that nature with more exact and historical book. We expect that. But here it says Roman bio. Now this is what it said. Bio offered the ancient biographer great flexibility for arranging material and inventing speeches in order to communicate the teachings, philosophy, and political views of the subject. And they often included legend. Now let's read that again, because it's not something that most Christians, Lacan himself, in fact, is an evangelical, and he has some kind of a theory of inerrancy, which I'm not quite sure that I grasp at the moment. But let's listen to what he says here that we find in the New Testament. And as we go through, actually, we see this verified pretty much. Bio offered an ancient biographer great flexibility in rearranging the material. What he's talking about here is that we know if we follow the stories told about in Jesus' ministry, in the book of Mark, in the book of Luke, and John, where they appear, we notice things are in all different kinds of orders. They don't conform the same order. And so what we're saying is that's cool, that's no problem. That's just people writing the history, that type of history, that wasn't a problem. Okay, so fine. Next, and inventing speeches in order to communicate the teachings. Inventing speeches, so maybe the difference between the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and Luke is because both of them were inventing the speeches to roughly correspond to what Jesus might have said. So think about that a second. The next time you read the Sermon on the Mount in either place, maybe Jesus didn't make that. Maybe Matthew and Luke just invented the words, the wording, because the concept involved with it is really what they wanted to let known. And we know, by the way, that happens in ancient histories. Herodotus did it, Thucydides did it, and in the Peloponnesian Wars. I mean, this is very well known. To communicate the teachings, philosophy, and political beliefs of the subject. And finally, and they often included legend. Legend meaning things that never occurred, but were stories that people added to about the person's life as it went on. Now remember, what does this mean? We've talked about this before, about how the New Testament was constructed, and when the Gospels came about, that you had Jesus die somewhere in the 30s. We're going to discuss about that, when it was. And the first Gospels were written about 65 or later, meaning that the first Gospels were written 25 to 30 years later. During this time is more than ample time for numerous legends, numerous stories to develop, and these would, of course, be added to the Gospels. He's basically admitting the fact that that's what it was. Because his bios was a flexible genre, flexible means that they were not tied to the truth. It is often difficult to determine where history ends and legend begins. Now I want to repeat that again. It is often difficult to determine where history ends and legend begins. Now again, Michael Lacona is an evangelical scholar. He, if you go look on YouTube, he debates constantly on the truth of what he believes to be the truth of the resurrection and subjects like that. But this is what he writes in this book. This is a book on history. Now again, let's continue. Another factor that contributes to the difficulty of knowing the past is the occasional unreliability of eyewitness testimony. This is very important to understand. We know this. Actually, we found this out many times. Nowadays, that they have DNA testing, they find out many times, in fact, that people who were supposed eyewitnesses to events actually make mistakes. So here we see. Lucian writes of those who lie about being eyewitnesses, when in fact they were not. So he says it's not just people who are eyewitnesses who misrepresent the things because memory, whatever. There's people who claim to be eyewitnesses and they were not. So, for example, as I pointed out with the canon, both John and John claimed to have been supposed to have been a eyewitness, and yet he wrote, and it was written in a language that John would not have known how to write. But even reports by eyewitnesses attempting to be truthful have challenges. Zabil notes that the eyewitness must, 1, accurately perceive it, 2, remember it with precision, 3, truthfully state it, and 4, successfully communicate it to others. Okay, so even if somebody sees something, he has to be able to put into words. I'll go back to it. Moreover, even bona fide eyewitnesses who are both sober and sincere often provide conflicting testimonies. Did the Titanic break in half, as many eyewitnesses claimed, or did it go down intact as reported by other eyewitnesses? So we see here an event that people saw, and 2 different things. What really happened, the exchange with Wittgenstein and Popper at Cambridge, the evening of October 25th. Did Whistler throw down a hot poker, storm out of the room and slam the door behind him, or was this a gross exaggeration of events? There are numerous conflicting reports from eyewitnesses. Okay, he brings 2 events. If I believe correctly, the Titanic, actually they found that it went down whole when they actually looked it up. But the point of the matter is that, what's he saying? He's saying a number of things. Eyewitness accounts, supposedly, are not always that very accurate. So when we come to the New Testament, when we look at some of these things, it's not, it's not necessarily that the writers were doing it in a nefarious reason. They were doing it because they're writing a type of biography. They never intended it to be what we would consider an inerrant biography, where there's no errors in it. Okay, I would assume what Conan is saying, the inerrancy comes down that what they wrote was under the Holy Spirit, and what they wrote is what we have, or we have close to what they wrote. The original was because of the Divine Spirit told them to write it that way. But again, when we're talking about inerrant history, we are interested in, did these things actually occur? Okay, now he brings this specifically a bit more. Okay, he brings here, the realistic historian John Zemamito agrees with the portrait analogy. The object of a portrait painting is to offer a penetrating insight into the character or personality of a sitter. However, he contends that the real issue is the debate over what is interpretative and what is literal. What he's saying is here, when the person is writing a history, is he interpreting the events, trying to make the events fit into a philosophical view, or is he saying, no, this is actually what happened, and that's what it was? Again, this is extremely important in the New Testament. Remember, the New Testament is not just a book of history, just to tell us and find events. So, for example, in the book of Kings, if we would find that there's some kind of a contradiction with the book of Chronicles, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't really affect us at all as far as our belief in it, because the purpose of that is basically as a historical record of what happened to the Jewish people at a certain time. And if somebody says there were more chariots than the others, that doesn't stop the fact that there was a battle, and there were a lot of people fighting against each other, and what the results of the battle, this doesn't change anything. It's just things of that nature. Whereas the New Testament, when you take events like, say, the virgin birth, the trial of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, different things of that nature, these are much more important, much more earth-shattering. If they were not literally correct, if they were an error, that would have a much more serious effect on people's lives. For example, let's take the virgin birth. If there was no virgin birth, if that was just a legend added that never really occurred, just like we have legends of many people, Alexander the Great, who was born, who supposedly his mother had relations with one of the gods and he was born from a god, or many of these other things. If that was the case, then that would have a phenomenal effect on the religion we call Christianity. No virgin birth, and many, many things disappear. It has effects on the Trinity. It has effects on Christology. It has effects on, all kinds of different things. And by the way, we do know that there were sects of Christians, like Ebionites and others, that did not believe that Jesus was born from a virgin birth. So you have to realize is if this is history, if this is not real history, but if it's like, phony Greek stories, legendary stories that people have, where some of it's going to be true, some of it might not be true, but it may be similar to that, whatever, that has a significant effect on us when we are reading it and when we are learning it. Remember that he said here clearly that historians writing this genre were not careful about what Jesus said. Now, we, of course, know a story in the New Testament, which you know that Jesus never did. And that's a story with a woman found in adultery. We talked about that before, where evangelical scholars who were being very careful with the text trying to reproduce the exact text, recognized that that could not have been in the original because it's not found in the same place in all the manuscripts where it is found, and a lot of manuscripts don't have it. So the famous saying of Jesus, "He was without sin throw the first stone," was never said by Jesus. And yet it's in the New Testament. And except for people who are familiar with scholarly stuff, people will look at that and take not only that, but the concept as part of the as a religious fact, whereas we know it's not there. So this is very important. These things are extremely important because they actually should influence how you're going to look at the New Testament. Now let me continue what he says here. This is a perplexing question that must be asked when we approach the canonical Gospels, especially the Gospel of John. Now, the reason why I talk about the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John is way out there with regards to the things with the synoptics. I'll just a simple example. We're going to talk about some of the other ones later. But a simple example is the book of John has Jesus' ministry lasting for 3 years, where the synoptics only have all the events packed into 1 year. Now, that shows a big difference. Critics of the Gospels frequently note stories reported only by John and charge him with invention, concluding that there is a lack of trustworthiness in what he reports. Okay? However, no one would charge a portrait as being errant because it betrayed something in the background that was not there during the sitting, but was created in order to communicate character or personality. So what he seems to be saying here is actually, he's trying to defend his view in inerrancy. Inerrancy means how the document was written about Jesus' life, that becomes divine. It's not like, when the prophets of old, Isaiah, they wrote down what God told them to write. So what they're communicating, what they're writing, is exactly the communication they received. Whereas he's trying to say here, as the gospel accounts, they're not that. What they are is the person heard speech or something like that. So the individual is relating the stories, maybe more legendary, more with him. But this is in order to bring down the main things about Jesus, and that's what's inerrant. Once it's in there, I assume he assumes the Holy Spirit told him how to do it, whatever. But that's where the inerrancy comes from. Literary devices such as invented speech and economy are common traits of ancient. So the Sermon on the Mount, invented speeches and stuff like that, it's very common. Thus, in some instances, those who complain of contradictions and inventions in the Gospels are guilty of judging them in terms of photographic accuracy when this may not have been the intent of the author. Now, this is extremely important. Many times Christians will say, well, the truth of the matter is what it is. They are really actually true. This is exactly how it happened. But one person saw it this way, one person saw it this way. It's like 4 people were talking about seeing an accident. But this is not what he's saying. What he's saying is a person saw the accident and he added in, and the person said different speech. He adds speeches for what the guy never said. So the guy was in an accident. He wasn't able to speak, but the person added things saying, I'm hurting, my pain, I have pain over here, when the person was not able to speak, for example, or even more, because it assumes that he's actually accurately doing it whenever places on. So this is important. It's very honest. It's very, very rare to see somebody who actually believes in inerrancy and who's actually a firm believer in all the tenets of Christianity, because I'm evangelical and everything, who will honestly come and say, yes, we have to agree that the New Testament is not written as a work of history as we would expect it to be nowadays. Still, this earmark of ancient bio makes hermeneutical consideration of the Gospels all the more challenging. Now, what he says here is very interesting. It brings up an interesting problem. If that's the case, then how are we going to interpret it when these words aren't really the words of Jesus? I actually had a discussion with somebody recently, I won't say who it is, on one of the words in the New Testament, which is in Greek. And now Jesus spoke Aramaic. It's true. In this particular word, actually, we do see that the Greek was used in later rabbinic writing with a different meaning from what most Christians understand, but it was used in rabbinic writing. And the question, of course, in this case is going to be, is what is the meaning of the words that Jesus actually spoke? If Jesus spoke in Aramaic and the Gospels are being written in Greek, then your hermeneutic, when your interpretation has to be based on the Hebrew or the Aramaic. Because if it's not based on the Aramaic, then you're going to have a nuance. You're going to see something's wrong. It's not going to work right. The Greek language will have a different nuance. So anybody who's out there who's multilingual, as I am, knows that when you're doing different languages, the words don't correspond one-to-one. There's nuances and there's idiosyncrasies with certain languages that you don't see in other ones, and they cause a lot of confusion. We will come across this a lot when we start getting more into answering, polemical arguments that come about, which are basically we'll go back into the actual Hebrew language and exactly what does the Hebrew actually say to deal with these issues. But it is a very common problem. It's very well known. Hebrew and Greek are totally different. Just like, for example, Hebrew and English, it's totally different. If you your English Bible, for example, the situation would be totally different. Now, in addition to what O'Connor said there, which is really very, very, very phenomenal, that you should actually have somebody who's a believer to be actually willing to admit to some of these things. Of course, when we look at the things, we have to consider our discussion of it and our judgment of it based on that. But the other question is very interesting, and we're going to bring this up. So I want you to think on this, okay? How did the author know what he wrote? How did the author know what he wrote? So, for example, in the birth stories, we find that angels speak to either Joseph or Mary, depending on which gospel we're talking about. How do we know? Who was told? The text doesn't tell us anything about that. And it's going to become even more important with other things, for example, in Pilate's trial, where they had no records. They don't have records. They didn't record his records. He made judgments whatever he wanted. There's nobody there. Okay? So this is a question we have to consider throughout when we read this stuff. When we find problems, the question is, if Matthew describes the birth of Jesus in one way, the question, how does he know that? Where did he get his information from? Okay? Just want to bring that to keep in mind. Let me just take a quick look and see if anybody asks a question. No, I don't see anything there. Okay, fine. Let's continue. Now, what's important here is like this. We are going to try and hone in on one major issue, and that's the birth and death of Jesus, when it occurred. Now, what we're going to find is that we're going to find a lot of errors as far as dates are concerned, confusion and uncertainty. But also we're going to find a number of instances where facts are brought there. And these will very much dovetail into what O'Connor just said, where people are bringing the philosophy. The stories are not true, but they're just brought there because they want to bring the philosophy. This is going to be especially the case. We're going to bring a number of instances soon, or later on, it's probably next week or a week after that, of where they relate in the New Testament, in Jesus' life, supposed teachings or incidents that occurred with him and the Pharisees, where in fact what they said was actually incorrect. The stories never occurred because what they're saying is false. And with that being the case, we look back at O'Connor and say, well, what are they really saying? Are they really saying that's what the case? Or are they really trying to say that, well, no, Jesus had some different disagreements with Pharisees? Okay, so we need to look at it. And then, of course, we have a different problem here. And this is something that each Christian has to look for themselves. O'Connor has for himself rationalized his view of inerrancy, meaning inerrancy starts when the document is written. It does not go back to the events that were written about. So he's saying his view of inerrancy is that if it appears in the New Testament, that doesn't mean that the event occurred as it says there. But once it was written there, everything from there on, what's there is accurate. There's no errors in our documents now, going back to those. And I assume, I've never seen him write this, but I assume what he's saying is, since the people who wrote these books were, according to him, inspired by the Holy Spirit, that inerrancy is based on, this is what the Holy Spirit decided wanted them to write. They wanted to write this way in this genre. And so from there on, the inerrancy, as far as from there, inerrancy does not necessarily mean that the events actually occurred as they said. That's what I assume he says, but that's not very satisfying. I think if we look at certain instances, like for example, the Israelites going out of the exodus from Egypt, if it didn't occur with 10 plagues, or they didn't happen, or they didn't receive the Torah afterwards, or such things like that, they were just exaggerations of life, I think we would have a totally different point of view about the Old Testament. So I think that his view of inerrancy is a problem, and that, in sense, tells us that these things that I'm going to point out, for at least most Christians who take it seriously, more modern Christians maybe not, but those who are evangelical, who believe inerrancy means what then Matthew says, that the virgin birth occurred in that way, as he describes, believes inerrancy means that it occurred as Matthew said, then they're going to have a problem. Because O'Connor is basically admitting, no, that's not what the case is. And we're going to see things will indicate to us, yes, there must be some problem with that. Now, in discussing the birth of Jesus, which is going to be the first thing we're going to discuss about, we're trying to discuss the birth of Jesus, when it was, what happened. When we discuss this, we have certain dates which we know factually outside of the New Testament. Remember in the beginning I started talking about, we know the dates of when Augustus was born and died, when Tiberius was born and died, when Caligula was born and died, and certain things. We have certain dates that are known. Okay, so if we assume certain things in the New Testament, which is, I won't say it's 100%, but it has a certain degree of probability, then there are a couple of events that we know for sure we can pretty much pay. The first one is the death of Herod. Why? Because Jesus was said to have been born while Herod was still king. Okay, that date we know for certainty. That was 4 BCE. We know when Herod died. Okay, so when we try and figure out what year Jesus was born, what year Jesus died, for the birth we know one thing. It has to be before 4 BCE. Okay, and as far as his death, there's something else that we have. We know that he died under Pontius Pilate. Every source that we have talks about him having died under Pontius Pilate. There's no reason to think that that may not be the case. Well, Pontius Pilate, we know, as a fact, was in his position from 26 to 36 CE. Now, if we look at the New Testament, again, we'll see in Matthew 2, 1 through 19, we see a number of events here having in Herod, and also Luke 3:23 talks about Herod. So we see, Luke 1:5, Now, since he died in 4 BCE, let's see if we can figure out some kind of a range, some kind of an idea of when Jesus could have had his ministry, so when he was born, when he could have died. Now, there are a few factors. There's one factor here. If we look at Luke 3:23. And this is what it says. Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his work. He was a son of Joseph, again, brings the ancestry here. Okay. So we see in 3:23 one important dating thing. Jesus, when he started his ministry, was 30 years old. Okay, so this sort of helps us in some way. Now, the next question is, how long was his ministry before he was executed? Now, according to the synoptics, it appears to be 1 year. John, it appears to be 3 years. Now, many Christian scholars say, well, no, the 1 year, the 1 year is actually 3 years, and they try and, sort of work it that way. So what we'll do is we'll analyze it from both, but assume 3 years. Assume 3 years. Although again, remember we have to go back to Lacan. Lacan says the legendary material, they weren't really exact in such kinds of things. So it's quite possible it could have been 2 years, and both of them had it wrong. But just they wrote it in a certain way that it came out. So it looks. We do not know. But in order to discuss this, let's just work from Jesus having a ministry of 3 years, which is what John says. Not that I'm saying that that's the fact, just saying that we have to do something, although it could be as short as 1 year. So let's look at it. Okay. When is the earliest Jesus could have been born? Based on this information that he was about 30 years old, say 30, and he had a ministry of 3 years. We know that he died under Pilate. So if he died the first year of Pilate, it's a very simple calculation. Okay? He would have died at 33. So if we take 33 years away from 26, we get to 8 BCE. How does that work? There are 25 years to the year 0, or the year 1 actually. And then we go back the other way and you have from the 33, you have another 8 years going back. So that makes it 8 BCE. Okay, so it's possible that it could have been there. Now again, that's assuming the 3 years. If it was only 1 year, it could have been as early as 6 BCE. So let's say from 8 BCE to 6 BCE is the earliest birth of Jesus. Okay, that still puts it within time of Herod. So now let's go the other way. Let's go the other way. Let's say, when is the latest he could have died? By doing that, we say, let's assume that he was born in the very last year of Herod's life. That would be 4 BCE. So, basing things on John, again, that he's 33, okay? Then we'd start from the date of 4 BCE. Adding 33 years, we get to the year of 30 CE. And if they had 1, it would have been 28 to 30. So we know that it's a time of 28 to 30. He would have started his ministry at 27 CE. And so that means that he would have died either 1 year or 3 years later, something like that. So we're talking about between 28 and 30 CE. That is clearly within the period of time of Pilate, and that allows for the latest. So what we're talking about here is, based on these calculations, Jesus would be born somewhere between 4 and 8 BCE, and could have died somewhere between 26 and 30 CE. Now let's ignore for 1 second the description in the New Testament in both Luke and Matthew that Jesus was born in the time of Herod. Let's see what will be the absolute latest possible. This is very important, what we're doing with this. The absolute latest possible would be, let's say that he died in 36 CE, okay? We would go back 33 years, and that would be 3 CE based on John, but it could be as little as 31 years. That could make it 5 CE. 5 CE. Okay, very important. So we have an area of when Jesus could have been born and when he could have died. And we should keep this in mind because we're going to come to it. So his death, if we assume that it wasn't time of Herod, then what we come to is that he has to have been born sometime between 8 and 4 BCE, leading to that his death could have occurred anytime between 26 and 30 CE. Okay? It's just based on those two facts, Herod and Pilate. We're going to see, in fact, that there's problems with that. In fact, we're going to find there's numerous problems come about with dating, because in the New Testament, various dates are thrown out dealing with things with Jesus' life, and we know when those dates are going to come out. So we're going to see a lot of these kinds of errors. So, for example, the dating of John's ministry is going to be an issue. That's going to affect us, because though Jesus was alive, Jesus actually became baptized from John, so that's going to affect. And of course, the dating of Jesus' ministry is important. Now, when it comes to the birth stories, we have very little reference to Jesus, his birth. Paul mentions it only once in the book of Galatians, chapter 4, verse 4. And here's what he says. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. That's it. That's all we know about Jesus' birth from Paul. Not very much. Not much at all. Now, some think that there's an indication of an allusion to the virgin birth there. It's quite possible that it's not the case. He says, born of one, born of the law. The law requires that the mother be Jewish in order to be considered Jewish and be, after all, under the law. There's an instance, I believe it was with Timothy, that Paul circumcised Timothy because his mother was Jewish, his father was Greek. If I remember that story correctly. So there's two virgin birth stories that we know of. One's in Matthew, one's in Luke. So the question is, how did Matthew and Luke know these stories? Especially Luke. Luke gives a much more advanced, much more extensive discussion. Okay, what I'd like to do is, I'm going to read to you Matthew's virgin birth story, and then I'll just note what we're reading as we go along, and then we're going to read Luke, see what Luke says, and then we'll start comparing. Because in obvious reading, when you read them, they're obviously different. They're just phenomenally different in many, many ways. There are only a few points in which they're the same. So let's just start reading. An account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, in verse 1 through 16, we're being given a genealogy, and the genealogy goes back to Abraham. Abraham, of course, is the father of Jewish people. Anybody who knows anything about Judaism knows that, in fact, we consider although we all go back to Adam, that's true, and we go back to Noah and all those things, the primary ancestor of ours, the one that I consider our first patriarch, is Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerach by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab the father of Nachshon, and Nachshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahav, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. Okay? And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah. I'm doing the English names here, not what the Hebrew is, although it's difficult to say the English from the Hebrew. Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Jerome, and Jerome the father of Uzziah, Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Amos, Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. Okay, continue. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, and Salathiel the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abiud, Abiud the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Ezra, Ezra the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, Eliud the father of Eliezer, Eliezer the father of Matan, Matan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. Okay, so here we see that Jesus' genealogy is being brought. Obviously, a very important thing because we know, of course, the Messiah is supposed to be descended from King David, so it's particularly broad. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14, and 14 generations, from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Now, there's errors in these things. They're known all over the place. That's not important. I am going to talk about this later, about what is problematic here that I see much more problematic than minor errors in genealogy. Oh, that's it. We will discuss some of these things later. Now he continues with a little bit of birth story. So 18 and 19 is the story of how Mary is found to be expected. Now, the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with a child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and willing to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. Okay, so we find that Mary is pregnant. She finds out, and of course he's going to divorce her because he knows the child's not his. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but he had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. Okay, so what do we find here? We find that his wife is pregnant, and then an angel comes to Joseph and tells him that, listen, don't worry about it, that your wife Mary is going to have a child, and it was actually from the Holy Spirit that she had the child. What's very interesting is here, I'll just make a point because it'll come up later on. Many times you see that Christians are trying to say that there's theophanies in the Tanakh. And one of the main things they say is, a lot of times it says angel of the Lord. Okay, Malach Hashem means angel of Hashem. Okay, and they try to say that that's actually theophany of Jesus. Well, according to that logic, it seems that saying here that Jesus came to Joseph and tell him that it's him who's in his mother's womb right then. It sounds very strange, but that's what it would seem to be saying here, if we're going to use that same kind of logic and consistency. One of the points that should be noted, we're going to find this all the time, as Christian missionaries do not approach it consistently. If they're going to say a certain principle in one place, they have to apply that principle to every place, not just where it works for them and not where and ignore where it doesn't. They have to apply a certain principle over all the time. And I try to do that. If you ever catch me not doing that, please reform me, because it's very important to keep that type of consistency. Otherwise, you end up doing things wrong. So anyway, she gets told that, and he's told that the reason why it's happening is because of a prophecy. It's Isaiah 7:14. We're going to discuss this. When there's various problems we find both with Matthew and with Luke in their stories, but we will discuss that later. One thing to point out here, of course, is that what we're seeing is what Lacona talks out, how Matthew here is trying to make things look like whatever happens to Jesus fulfills biblical prophecy. So as Lacona says, these types of the genre from biography will bring things there, even though that's not might even the case, just to try and make their point. Just keep it in mind. Okay, chapter 2. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem. So we have wise men coming, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage." So this is, of course, the famous thing that we see, that supposedly there's some kind of a star going across the sky that they're following that. When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea. For so it has been written by the prophet, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is a shepherd, who is to shepherd my people Israel." Okay, that's Micah. We'll do with Micah. So, okay, we have all these people coming there. Now, I have to point out to you that Josephus, who's a historian of this period of time, has a lot about Herod. A lot about Herod. There is not one word in Josephus that verifies anything that we're going to hear and see in the story. Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. So apparently there was no star, and poof, star appears. Very interesting. Unknown from, but it's very interesting. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." So now he has these wise men come. They come to him. There's a tradition, the three names of these wise men. I can't remember what they are, but it's some kind of a tradition. Again, as we noticed, there's a lot of legends and stuff. If you went to Christian churches, I'm sure you heard a lot of legends and stuff. Stories just made up. When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising. So what the star is moving in front of them, like if you look at a helicopter in the air with the light coming down, it's like that's what they're seeing. That's going on like that. Until it stopped over the place where the child was, like there was a helicopter. Okay, you have to in mind when you're reading this, you have to have in mind that there's a helicopter up there with a beam coming down. If you live in cities, sometimes you see the police going around. They have a helicopter with a beam coming down, following, and so they're following that light, and it stops somewhere. When then they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. Now what happens then? On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary's mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. So what happened is Mary and Joseph were in their house, and the wise men come, open up the door, they see him, and they give him homage. Then opening the treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another route. So apparently they had a dream that's not mentioned here, but the dream tells them to go somewhere like that. Okay, now we continue with the story. We have finished with the wise men. The wise men come, they come to Herod, they go there, they see the child, they worship the child, and they just disappear. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. So now Joseph has another angel appearing to him. Remember, he already had the angel of the Lord come to one time, now it's the angel of the Lord another time. Again, another proof that this angel of the Lord cannot be Jesus, because Jesus is already there. So how could the angel of the Lord be Jesus? Don't know. That's not for me to answer. Just want you to keep it in mind, because when we do get to discussions of the Trinity and Theophanies in the Old Testament, they say the angel of the Lord means Jesus. Well, if the angel wouldn't be Jesus, how could Jesus be coming to his father in a dream when he's a baby in front of him also? Okay. Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. So the angel of the Lord comes to him, tells him, "Hey, scat, get out of here." Then Joseph got up. Now, again, let me start again. Now, after they had left, that means the angels, the wise men come there, do their thing. After they leave, right then, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph immediately in the dream, said, "Get up, take the child and his mother to Egypt." William said something? Oh.
No.
Okay, I'll repeat again.
I'm good. I didn't say anything, though. I was just listening for you.
Oh, then there was an echo. Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child and slay. Then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. Okay. Now, we don't know when the child was born. The death of Herod is in 4 BCE, so Jesus could have been born any time around that. You have no idea. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I've called my son. This is Hoshea. We will discuss this later. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. So the wise men told him when he was born, apparently it was approximately 2 years. So that means that Jesus could have been born, according to this, as early as 6 BCE. Now, of course, if we take from 6 BCE, we start pushing back the date so that 30 CE cannot be when the execution occurs. It has to be maybe 29 or 28 when Jesus is executed. It could be as early as 28, but maybe 20, 30, but it could be even earlier. Okay, and most likely it's early because if the wise men told him he was born, we know Jesus was in fact born at the time when they spoke to him. So it seems to indicate that he could be 2 years or younger, but 2 years both. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel, weeping for her children, she refused to be consoled because they are no more. Okay, so that is supposed to be what Jeremiah is saying. Is supposed to be about what happened to the Messiah when he's born. We're coming to the end of time, so let me just finish with this, make a couple of comments, and next week we'll pick up with Luke. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, okay, Herod dies, 4 BCE, and Joseph again, the angel of the Lord again comes, third time the angel of the Lord, I guess Jesus comes to him in a dream third time or whatever, so again, just keep this in the back of your minds because we're going to come up to discussing sometime in the future the virgin birth, the Trinity and Christology, what Jesus is, and we will come to discussions of theophanies in the Old Testament, which are brought out. Just remember, angel of the Lord is used in the New Testament, and it doesn't mean Jesus. Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are seeking the child's life are dead. Okay. Then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. And when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. So again, he gets warned in a dream. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth. So he made his home in Nazareth. He lived in Bethlehem. That's where he lived. He had a house in Bethlehem where he lived. That's where the baby was born. And the wise men come to him. And then, after he goes to Egypt, and after that he comes and he moves to Nazareth in order to avoid going to his home, which was in Bethlehem. So that it was spoken to him, the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. A Nazarene coming from the word Nazareth. Okay. That is the birth story according to Matthew. Now, it's very important that we do it this way, because many times you read these stories, but you don't read them side by side. What you do is you read them, and then, you've read the story, but you haven't read, you don't read them side by side to compare them one to another. Okay, before I lock it off, let me just see if there's a very quick question I can answer here that's related to what we talked about, and if not, no.
Okay.
Yes, Rose Petal, that's right, angel of the Lord. We will come to that when we talk about theophanies, a very important point. I don't see anything here.
Yep. And we are right at the top of the hour too, so it's good timing. You can actually time that well.
Yeah, I was just looking to see if there's anything,
Right on. Very good. All right, well, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Rabbi, I'm sorry, Rabbi, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, we'll leave it here. Next week we're going to deal with Luke, and then we're going to compare and contrast the basic differences, and then we're going to deal with the problems that we see from the stories themselves, and then come to some kind of conclusion about what we think about the historicity of the events described.
Most excellent. Very cool. Well, it was definitely informative. Oh my gosh, today has been like a really slam dunk on a lot of really good information. Let's go back before you and seeing. There's oftentimes we'll have an hour or a 2-hour show, and you might get about 30 to 45 to 50, 60% that's really, really super hot. But today was like slam packed full with so much good stuff, including your show. We appreciate you, Rabbi. Thank you so much for your dedication and your motivation for just exposing this stuff is very clear in the way you teach. We really appreciate that very much.
Okay.
Okay, guys, thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you same time, same place next week. Now, listen, next week I'm going to be out of town, but I think I'm going to be back in town early enough to where we can still do our show. No guarantee on that, but I'm going to try. If I can't, I'll try to set up one of our classics, a full show as a premiere so people can log in and chat and talk amongst themselves. But I think I'll be back in time for us to do our show next week. If I can't, I'll definitely contact you, Rabbi, and let you know ahead of time, okay?
No problem. Listen, I'm always preparing shows and things that I'm doing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Looking
forward
to the next show, too. I mean, your titles you've got coming up is going to be really intriguing for everyone, and they're going to definitely not want to miss these. So, very good. Rabbi, thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, hit that thumbs up. It's very important, so it'll help the YouTube search algorithms. Please do that. Thank you so much. Later, guys. Have a great week, Rabbi. Thank you.
חשוב מכל חשוב